welcome to Tanner's Just Jets. Hello, Warbirders. I am so excited about today because I get to enjoy the show just like you guys, because my collaborator Tanner did all the research and writing for it. And I get to learn something completely new to me. For any new listeners, Tanner is a third-generation operational Air Force fighter pilot. So she is an expert on jet technology, operational details, tactics, and weaponry. For security reasons, she still can't narrate her own stuff yet, but I'm happy to just sip some coffee and read her words to you. Let's dive in. Welcome back, everybody, to Tanner's Just Jets. Hope you didn't miss me too bad. I know my recent episodes have had a pattern of two features. They have all been American naval aircraft and propeller aircraft. Sorry I've been cheating on jets, but I thought I'd break that spell today. Today's episode will focus on the Soviet Union's rush to harness jet technology after World War II and use it to its advantage over the West, even if the rush to overwhelm the West came at a cost. I think the best way to start off this episode is by asking if you remember one of Brian's first episodes, the ME-262. It's been a while, so let me remind you of what's important within that aircraft, the engines. Originally, she was supposed to have BMW 003 turbojet engines, but Germany wasn't doing so well back then. Maybe the last thing on the average BMW worker's mind in 1944 was producing a final BMW 003 engine with all the quirks worked out, then producing it quickly and at high rates of production. So, instead, the role fell upon the UMO 004 engines. Now, some German jet aircraft did get the BMW 003, but not aircraft produced in large numbers, and not the ME-262. In fact, the aircraft which did get the 003 was the HE-162 and the late war four-engined Arado AR-234. Another cool fact about the HE-162 is that the Russians captured and tested a few along with some ME-262s. And now this brings us to where our story takes place today. Because even though they had tested some jet aircraft, the Russians were noticeably behind their counterparts in World War II, with the British, Americans, and Germans all producing or designing their own jet aircraft during the war. The Russians had looked into jet technology a little, like the BI program. On July 12, 1940, Viktor Fedorich Bolkovitynov joined a special committee meeting focused on creating a high-altitude, high-speed aircraft, accompanied by his leading engineers, Alexander Berezniak and Alexei Isayev. Just over a year later, by September 1, 1941, the Berezniak-Isayev, or BI-1, was constructed and prepared for glide testing, as its intended engine was not yet available. By the following year, the aircraft was fully assembled for its initial powered trials. On May 15, 1942, test pilot Grigory Yakovlevich Bakhchivantsy flew the BI-1 in its initial powered flight. The aircraft's fuel, a hazardous blend of kerosene and red fuming nitric acid, caused severe corrosion, rendering the BI-1 unsafe for further flights and leading to its retirement. One thing I found kind of funny about this project is its offensive armaments. Featuring two 20mm cannons with only 45 rounds per gun, so a comically small ammo load of 90 20mm shells. But maybe, as we will come to learn, it was best with the dawning age of jet technology to start off easily when adding cannons onto a prototype. We will include a photo of the BI-1 on Patreon. The Soviet leadership had seen German cities be obliterated by relentless Allied conventional bombing, and then they saw the addition of the atomic bomb. A single bomb with the power to wipe out an entire city, and with the USA and USSR slowly falling out close to the end of the war, it showed an urgent need to boost the USSR's air defenses. At the time, the only way to stop an American or British bomber force was with interceptor aircraft. Founded in 1939 and headed by Artem Migoyan and Mikhail Gurevich, the aircraft company Mikoyan, otherwise known as MiG, was a Soviet aviation company that has been making planes since the Great Patriotic War, which is what World War II is known as in Russia. Today they have clearly fallen behind their competitor sister company Sukhoi, yet still produce aircraft and parts. In the modern Russian fleet, the MiG-31 and MiG-29, MiG-35 are the only aircraft that have the MiG name, the 31 being a replacement for the Mach 3 MiG-25, which I hope to get to. I think if told correctly, the story's a real treat, especially what it leads to, surprisingly, as an upgraded replacement for the MiG-25. The MiG-31 actually reaches a slower top speed than its predecessor, the MiG-25. Typically, in the MiG-31's era, replacement jets would reach a higher speed. The MiG-29 is an aging jet, but also introduces many technological firsts, like a helmet-mounted HUD featuring off-bore radar lock capabilities. And its younger sister, a new modernized MiG-29 that came out in 2019. While 3 aircraft seem like a lot, Sukhoi produces the Su-25 Frogfoot ground attack plane used heavily in Ukraine, the Su-27 and its upgraded sisters, the large Su-30 and Su-35, and also Russia's first 5th-generation jet, the Su-57 Felon. Some other companies that exist in the Russian air market are Tupolev, producing most of the heavy bombers and cargo planes for the Air Force. And today's story's rival company, Yakolev, producing many famous aircraft in World War II and founded by Alexander Sergeyevich Yakolev. They have possibly become even more irrelevant than Migoyan in the modern age, with the Yak-130, a 2010 introduced trainer, being the only aircraft built by Yakolev owned and maintained by the Russian Air Force. Their project would come to be known as the Yak-15. In February 1945, the Council of People's Commissars, basically the highest-ranking executive branch in Russia, gave MiG and Yakolev an order. They wanted a single-seat jet powered by 2 captured German BMW 003 engines that would be intended to destroy enemy bombers using its 2 23mm cannon. Wow, a 23mm cannon! That will do a lot of damage. The order seems simple enough, right? Well, a month before the cessation of hostilities in World War II, a more in-depth follow-up order came into MiG and Yak. They wanted a maximum speed of 550 miles per hour, or 900 kilometers per hour while flying at sea level, and 565 miles per hour, 910 kilometers per hour at 5,000 meters altitude or 16,400 feet. Mach 0.73. Okay, easy enough. Well, it should be able to reach that altitude in 4 minutes or less, have a maximum range of 510 miles, and 3 prototypes will need to be ready by March 15, 1946. The prototype would come to be known as the I-300, or also known as the Izdaleye F, Product F in English, with work starting in 1945 for the prototype. One of the main focuses in design was stability upon landing. At its highest point, the tail being 10.5 feet. It met into the fuselage flushly, helping to give the aircraft improved lateral stability and maneuverability at low speeds. The fuselage was a long pod with a large intake in front, like seen on her newer sisters, the MiG-15, 17, and 19. And, like the MiG-15, has its guns built into the intake system. We will come back to this later a few times. Just behind the guns and intake system is a cockpit put into the pod with a large bubble canopy on top to help with visibility, and behind the cockpit, the unswept wings attached low to the fuselage with a wingspan of 32 feet. I'll add some photos, of course, on Patreon to help understand what I'm saying. Being also a nose tricycle landing gear, the developers ran into trouble fitting the engine intake, guns, and nose gear all into the front of the plane. Some other design troubles they had to tweak out were the engine's exhaust melting the fuselage. To visualize it, the engine is at the bottom of the fuselage with the exhaust nozzle pointing out towards the tail section, where things can get melty. Originally, the design called for the engines to be out on the wings, like the Me-262. But after the engineers got a look at the Yakolev project, a whole redesign was done on the aircraft, mainly moving the engines into the body with the exhausts being the way they are, and the large intake on the front of the jet. While the prototypes and the first 10 production variants were fitted with captured BMW 003 engines, the rest were fitted with a Soviet-built copy of the 003, known as the RD-20. To protect the RD-20 from burning the plane like WD-40 sprayed at a lighter, they added a steel laminate heat shield, sorta like what's seen on the F-4 Phantom, to solve the very same issue. The pilots would rely on oxygen the whole flight, as the cockpit was not pressurized. 4 fuel tanks were located in the fuselage, and 3 were in each wing. The intake mentioned earlier had a 57mm cannon, known as the OKB-1657, sticking out of the bulkhead running down the middle of the intake, with 27 rounds. The 57mm cannon being an idea added by the plane's designer Artem Mikoyan. Beneath the 57mm was 2 Nudelman Suronov NS-23 23mm autocannon, sticking out of the bottom half of the intake parallel to each other, with 80 rounds each, all 3 guns firing in a triangle cone of doom. The first product, F, had its first engine start test on December 30th, 1945. And revealed many issues to be worked out. The engine exhaust would cause low pressure under the tail, causing the tail to fall and tilt downwards, causing stalls. The heat shield didn't work as expected after initial engine starts, showing deformities in the tail section of the boom. These were caused by the duraluminum skin placed over the all-steel fuselage, with those 2 materials expanding at different heats and at different rates. Yucky. The rear fuselage and heat shield were both redesigned to solve this. After these fixes were done, on September 23, 1946, the new prototype was put on a flatbed truck and sent to the city of Ramenskoye's Flight Research Institute for its first test flight. Now, to be the first Soviet aircraft-produced jet to fly over the Soviet Union was a highly sought-after accomplishment. On April 24th, 1946, here at the Flight Institute's airfield, representatives from Mikoyan met with reps from Yakolev, who had produced the Yak-15, another contender in the project, a jet-powered Yak-3U. Their focus was producing a jet as quick as possible And their plan to achieve this was adapting an already true and tested pistoned engine fighter. Meeting at the airfield, with both aircraft ready to fly, they had to decide who would be the first ones to accomplish the title of first jet aircraft to fly over the Soviet Union. And the only fair way they found was to flip a coin, or so one story goes. The I-300 MiG Design 1, and for 6 minutes was the first jet-powered aircraft to fly over the Soviet Union, while the Yakovlev engineers looked on in anger, seeing as their aircraft, the Yak-15, had been ready to fly months before the MiG-9. But the designer, Alexander Yakovlev, had been very wary of the design and had taken his time to make sure it was just right. Another story goes that due to a large air training exercise for the upcoming May Day parade, had the skies shut down. While patiently waiting to be able to fly the Yak-15 for its test flight, Artem Mikoyan called the commander of the Moscow military district, who replied, "For you, Artem Mikoyanovich, we can always make exception." And while sitting on the runway, wingtip to wingtip, with the Yak-15, the MiG-9 had its engine started and rolled down the runway, to which I assume was the surprise of the Yak designers. And the MiG-9 was the first jet to fly over the USSR. No matter which story you believe, they both lead to the same truth. The early flights of the MiG-9 showed more problems to be worked out. The newly designed heat shield caused vibration and stability problems, and after the 11th test flight, the heat shield was stiffened, but this did not solve the problem. On July 11, 1946, the MiG test pilot, along with some high-ranking officials, had been watching the Yak-15 take off and do sharp turns and rolls with a captured HE-162. So the MiG test pilot took off soon after thinking, the MiG can do that too. But the attachment lugs of the wing's leading-edge horizontal stabilizers were knocked out of position by over G, and they hit the horizontal stabilizer, damaging it. Then the plane dropped its left wing harshly and never recovered, killing the test pilot after just 6.5 hours logged flight time. Not to mention those high-ranking officials were the newly appointed members of the Management of the Aviation Ministry of the Soviet Air Force, after the previous ones were arrested and sent for a sentence in the Gulag for providing poor aircraft during World War II. Usually a crash would require you to go back and fix many things, do many more test flights, etc. But the Aviation Ministry of the USSR decided to ask MiG to build the same prototype F for the upcoming Soviet Air Force Day parade in August of 1946. This order was completed successfully in time, and it flew in the parade. After that, the MiG-9 entered a new, much-needed testing stage, in which the second test airframe had its horizontal stabilizer disintegrated by the exhausts. Though thankfully, the pilot landed her safely, and after the same thing happened to the third prototype, the tail was finally redesigned and reinforced. Then came the first in-flight live-fire test of the guns. And what they discovered was that the gases produced by the 57 and 20 millimeter cannons would be sucked into the intake when fired, causing the fuel-oxygen mixture that powered the jet to be disrupted, causing an engine flame-out. Imagine the surprise as the first firing of the guns caused everything to go quiet. Did I press the wrong button? Did I do something wrong? As this plane was designed to be an interceptor, relying on both its engines and guns heavily, the gas ingestion was considered suboptimal. Yet, for the Soviet Air Force's higher-ups, this was manageable. Approaching in November of 1946 was the October Revolution Air Parade. And with tensions rising with the West, they wanted to find a way to sow fear into American officials who watched these parades so closely for any signs of Soviet advancements. It was decided that going from the prototype Yak-15 and MiG-9 to a whole bunch of production-made jet aircraft flying in formation would do just the trick. So, 15 I-300 prototypes, or otherwise known at this time as the MiG-9, would be called pre-series aircraft and were ordered for the upcoming October Revolution Parade from Aircraft Factory 1 in Kuibyshev. Now, mind you, the last time we left off on the timeline, it was about August. And so when this order came out, the team had a, in air quotes, generous timeline of 40 days in which to complete it. Now remember, the gas ingestion and the prototype troubles, and this was a fairly new aircraft, especially compared to today's standards. Nevertheless, the USSR decided to put its faith in the MiG-9 and Yak-15 prototypes, ordering them to at least fake the role of air dominance over the West. This decision of policy would be known as the Parade Order. In a rush, MiG sent 25 aircraft engineers from Moscow to Kuibyshev. Here is a quote on the conditions of this period from a book written by one of the fellow engineers. Open quote. There were mattresses put next to assembly line. Those who were asleep literally fell on them to get a short sleep. The breaks for teas, lunches, and dinners were all considered of little importance. The work shifts didn't have any limits, sometimes lasting for 2 to 3 days non-stop. Those lucky ones who had the strength to get to their rooms turned on their stoves or kettles, then often fell asleep right away, forgetting about them. Our stoves and kettles quickly fell into disrepair. People remained hungry, but despite the exhausting pace, work continued to be done steadily. End quote. Their hard work definitely showed off as the aircraft came off the assembly line, one after another, quickly. However, the quality of these aircraft could be called into question. One test showed the MiG couldn't retract its landing gear. Another, when being rolled out from the assembly line, had its rudder fall off, hitting and damaging the fuselage too. Nevertheless, by its deadline, in November, 15 of the MiG-9s had been rolled off of the assembly line. Let's just not mention how 5 of them were incomplete, missing a variety of guns, avionics, and some engines. The incomplete 5 were left behind at the factory, while the other 10 were loaded on a train to Moscow for the parade. What a great achievement, having all the aircraft ready in time for the parade, which was soon after cancelled due to rain. Those poor, poor engineers. 2 of those prototypes would later go on for the acceptance trials by the USSR. The trials would be held for the aircraft going until June of 1946. The pilots had a favorable opinion of the MiG's flight characteristics, and hopefully so, after all the modifications it had during development. Before the plane was even accepted, actual production models were put into order at Factory Number 1 mentioned earlier, with 48 aircraft being ordered, hoping what troubles the plane had would work themselves out. Some noticeable fallbacks compared to other aircraft of the era were no ejection seats, as these were somewhat new at the time, no fire suppression system, and no air brakes. Air brakes are a large help when slowing down between the speeds of normal flight until a safe speed to deploy flaps at a landing angle, knocking off more speed, allowing for a smooth landing. While not critical, they definitely help a lot with landing when in a fast mover like the MiG-9 was designed to be. The problem with not having a fire suppression system was while the switch from avgas in propeller planes to kerosene jet fuel in the MiG-9 was that the kerosene could catch fire quicker, but it would burn at a slow, long pace, while avgas has a faster burn rate with a possibility to help extinguish the fire more quickly. Not having a fire suppression system and just watching your plane burn like a kerosene lamp is no way to go. In hopes of getting maximum thrust performance out of the aircraft, pilot armor was left out, leaving him unprotected, besides the pod that he sat in and no self-sealing fuel tanks. And then, of course, we come back to the problem of the gun gas ingestion. As mentioned earlier, the gas would cause the engines to flame out. This problem would only occur at altitudes of 3,000 meters and up, which translates to about 9,000 feet. Now, that may not be a problem if for the fact that this plane was a bomber interceptor, and the fact that the bombers it was supposed to be intercepting at the time were the Silver Plate B-29s. This was the code name for superfortresses capable of carrying the atomic bomb, and they had a main cruising altitude of 9,000 meters, or 32,000 feet. Well, this made it a problem that needed fixing. The first attempt at a fix was replacing the main 57mm cannon in the middle of the intake with a smaller, yet still very powerful, 37mm cannon. Another fix was to add fume extractors. These were covers fitted over the barrels that would direct the gases downwards under the plane, instead of going straight into the intake. But it was found that this would only work for the 23mm cannons located at the bottom of the intake lip, as the 37mm cannon would have the gases directed downwards, yet still then into the intake. So a fix for the 37mm cannon was made with a special, longer fume extractor that had holes on top and bottom, pushing the gas clear of the intake. It was soon called the butterfly extractor, as the two ends of the block placed onto the 37mm cannon barrel looked like a butterfly with wings. Though this fix came with a cost. The butterfly extractor would add an extra 149 pounds to the aircraft, and 24 additional test flights were needed to fix the problems caused by all of the weight added to the nose. Problem solved? Maybe not. While affecting flight controls and adding more test flights, the butterfly also had a lifespan of only about 800 rounds of 37mm ammunition, before cracks would form, causing the possibility of it breaking apart at any moment, causing debris to be sucked into the air intake. If it's not gun gases, it's gun debris, and this design was rejected. By this time, crafty flight engineers had gotten the guns to be firing at higher altitudes without gas ingestion, up to around 7,000 meters or 23,000 feet, although that's still short of the 9,000 meters or 32,000 feet of the atomic bomb carrying B-29s. Pilots had learned a trick to maximizing gun firing altitude, and this was controlling the thrust of the aircraft. For example, if traveling at 205 miles per hour at the altitude of a B-29, you could lower the engine RPM from 3.5 to 8.5 thousand rotations per minute to fire the guns without ingestion. But if at a lower altitude than the B-29 and flying at faster speeds, the RPM had to be increased from that 8.5 to 9.5 thousand RPM. After much testing, a rule was put into place that the pilots could not fire all three guns at the same time at any altitude to reduce chances of ingestion, while the 37mm cannon was only allowed to be fired at altitudes below 10,000 feet. Now, of the 15 aircraft ordered for the October Revolution Parade, while some of those planes went on to testing of the MiG-9 to enter service, some of the others were used to make special variants of the MiG-9, like a two-seat variant called the I-103T. It lost 1/3 of its fuel capacity with the removal of a fuselage fuel tank for space for the second pilot to sit in a tandem cockpit, meaning behind the pilot, like the trainer F-9F Panther we covered in my earlier episode. Both pilots had a full set of controls and an intercom system to help train new pilots. Each pilot also had an early ejection seat, a reverse-engineered copy of the HE-162's seat. These planes would be ordered into production when the Soviets looked to take the parade order to a new level at 1947's May Day Parade, and ordered 10 of these two-seaters along with 40 of the 48 MiG-9s that had been delivered by Factory 1 at the time. The first of the two-seaters would be completed in January of 1947 and accepted, although flight testing had not been completed yet. The ejection seat, while never tested in the air, had extensive ground testing to ensure its effectiveness. While not done with testing time for the May Day Parade, all planes ordered had been delivered. For getting all these planes ready for parade on time, and them actually being allowed to fly because of weather, was considered a great accomplishment by Artem Mikoyan and Mikhail Yurovich. Both would be recognized and awarded the Stalin Prize, an award recognizing great achievements in the field of science, math, arts, and architecture for the Soviet Union. State acceptance trials for the two-seater were finished on June 2nd, with the plane being rejected due to poor visibility. Kind of funny to think that they still flew it in the air parade, but this was such of the order. On July 15th, a new two-seater was introduced, replacing its armor-proofed canopy with a new unarmored glass one, needing some reshaping of the cockpit, like removing the wall dividing the two pilots. Now, one of my favorite things to do when I flew tandem in training on the Aeromachi M346 was passing snacks back and forth as they'd easily float with the zero-G forces when in a maneuver to your backseater, or to the front with me, or vice versa. I can imagine this only helped the pilots achieve that maneuver, although I'm not sure that's what the designers had in mind. Unlike its one-seater predecessor, this plane was fitted with air brakes. Yay! To help with the lost fuel tanks in the adding of the two pilots, two jettisonable 260-liter or 69-gallon fuel tanks were attached under the wings. The aircraft finally passed state acceptance trials in 1947 and was recommended the two-seat variant be called the UTI MiG-9. The ejection seats then had more extensive testing started, which continued until 1948, when the seats were approved and the UTI MiG-9, while able to be approved for combat, was listed as obsolete, as by that time the MiG-15 was flying. Going back to the single-seated MiG-9 and the first 48 ordered before the May Parade, remember, these were the planes ordered before the MiG-9 had even passed its acceptance trials. While 40 single-seaters and 10 two-seaters had been delivered in time for the air parade, most had been delivered without guns, as the subcontractor for the armaments were behind schedule. So to fix this, they'd put broomsticks in their place for the parade. After the parade, these aircraft were handed over to the regular Soviet air units to use. And from this came unfavorable opinions. For one was the mathematical equations you had to do to be able to operate the guns. which made bomber interception almost impossible. Not to mention, while you have your pen and paper out and thinking cap on, the enemy bomber is returning fire at you. But if you survive this engagement, you might not be so lucky with the bomber's fighter protection. Simulated combat tests against other planes simulating bomber escorts had turned out undesirable, as the MiG-9 would go on to lose against its jet counterparts like Yakovlev's Yak-15 and the Lavochian LA-156. Even older propeller planes also had an advantage, as the MiG-9 lost to the P-63 King Cobra, the LA-9, and the Spitfire Mark 9. Against each plane, it would have about 30 mock dogfights, with the MiG-9 only winning when it finally faced the pokey Tupolev Tu-2 bomber. Takeoff and landing were also troublesome, as a runway of 3,300 feet was needed, while the Yak-15 only needed 1,200 feet. Not to mention, while landing, to help the short lifespan of its engines, they were turned off, turning the jet essentially into a glider. Also, while its cockpit at the upper part of the pod offered great visibility, it made the wings less visible, which propeller pilots had a habit of using to help calculate landings, and was a habit that needed to be kicked. It can also be called into question if these problems were of the jet itself or the transfer of pilots into the jet age, as the Yak-15 proved more stable to pilots, as they were used to the platform with a propeller, and they just had to adapt to the jet engine, not an entirely new plane like the MiG-15 was. This jet also came as a burden to flight crews, as a simple refueling could take up to an hour, as the wing tanks were fed by filling the main tanks in the body, which would drain down into the wing tanks, followed by the main tank being topped off. Also, the quantity of fuel after each flight had to be checked visually, as the early version of the MiG-9 had no fuel gauge. This was somewhat remedied by adding a fuel clicker, which was like an old-fashioned kitchen timer. You would have to manually set the fuel amount with a dial, instead of the gauge reading it, and the instrument would count down as you flew. In January 1948, Alexander Abramson, a MiG factory engineer, visited an airfield to see the 3rd Guard Aviation Regiment's MiG-9s, only to find, of all the planes received only a month and a half earlier, only one had flown. Just one flight, while the rest of the MiG-9s were left out in the open, on the field, and their engines had started to rust. As Alexander later learned, that only 30% of the regiment's required number of aircrew was filled, and those who were there, they didn't have enough boots to handle the weather conditions of the Soviet Union to go out to maintain the planes. Another variant of the MiG-9 would be one of the parade fighter's prototypes, written up to be fitted with a single Lilka TR-1 turbojet engine, like that seen on the twin-engine Su-11 or four-engine Il-22 jet-powered bomber. But these engines were not ready at the time, leading to the plan being scrapped. It was known as the I-305. Another write-up may have had more luck. The I-307 had twin RD-21 engines and the cockpit was pressurized. The armaments were rearranged, with the 23mm cannon being moved to the sides of the jet, just in front of the cockpit, with the 37mm cannon being just underneath one of them on the starboard side area, leaving all 3 guns well clear of the intake, and housing them in a pod mount system, instead of them being free-hanging guns like before. The cockpit was also slightly moved forward, giving a better view upon landing, and air brakes were fitted. While reaching speeds of 600 miles per hour at 16,000 feet or 5,000 meters, this aircraft was thought to do great at state acceptance trials, but was rejected as the engines kept flaming out when run at lower RPMs. It was also known as the MiG-9M. The pressurized cockpit's workmanship could be called thrown together at best, and the mounts for the cannon were not ready yet. Another test bed, the I-320, got fitted with our friend, the good old Rolls-Royce 9, an imported version of the centrifugal flow engine. The armament had yet another placement design, seeing the 37mm cannon placed under and behind the intake, and the 23mm cannons being fitted on the sides, like the previous versions. But this version too was rejected, as the imported 9s were being used for the MiG-15s. In mid-1946, the Council of Ministers ordered a special prototype of the I-307 featuring an afterburner or reheater, the BMW 003S engines. They wanted them home-built in the Soviet Union, but were not ready yet, so it was fitted with German engines for the manufacturer test flights. 12mm plates of armor were added in front and to the rear of the pilot to protect from bombers and fighters respectively, and the front windscreen was fitted with bulletproof glass. When manufacturers' flight test finished on June 21st, they soon after refitted the jet with the Soviet-made copy of the engines instead of the German ones. State acceptance trials started August 2nd, but the plane would shortly crash on August 19th, 17 days later. A second prototype of the I-307 was quickly converted. It was given the same pilot armor and bulletproof glass, but would use RD-21 engines as the only sets of Soviet-made afterburning BMW 003Ss had crashed with the earlier prototype. Top speeds reached 588 miles per hour at 3,000 meters or 9,800 feet, and 577 miles per hour at 5,200 meters or 17,100 feet. Not much work was done with this prototype though, as advances in technology had come, like the MiG-15 by that time. Finally, the MiG-9L was a test bed variant for anti-shipping cruise missiles, an unmanned self-propelled missile made specifically for targeting ships. A second unpressurized cockpit was added for a missile operator who would aim and control the missile. A K-1M target illumination radar using a focused beam to lock onto a target like a ship and give direct guidance to the missile to the ship. The radar was fitted above the air intake. An aft-looking radar was fitted at the bottom of the tail in a cigar-shaped pod. It would let the pilot know when an enemy was sneaking up on their tail, like a fighter. It tested the KS-1 Comet until it was accepted in 1952. Now we can get to its usage in combat. She just didn't fly in parades, though that's what she was best at. But first, a few words on the NATO reporting name system. Formally adopted on March 1, 1956, the NATO reporting system was founded to make identification of enemy aircraft over radio easier, and used names sometimes before the Soviet name of the aircraft was announced to the West. It would use a system based like a phonetic alphabet, with the planes getting a typical English-sounding name that's easily pronounced across the NATO base. A propeller-driven plane would receive one syllable, while jet aircraft would receive two. The first letter of these words would denote the class the aircraft belongs to. F for fighter, B for bomber, C for cargo. Let's run through some quick examples. The MiG-9, because it's a jet fighter, gets two syllables. And filling the fighter role, the name would start with an anyone? An F, correct. The MiG-29 was called the Fulcrum. The A-20, also known as DB-7, is a United States propeller bomber provided to Russia during the war, but some malingered past the war's end. Since it is a propeller-driven bomber, its NATO name will get one syllable, and the word will start with the letter B, and so its NATO's name was Box. Nobody said all the names had to be flashy. You'll learn this clearly when we enter the MiG-15 episode. But today's plane, the MiG-9, is a jet-driven fighter. So it would receive two syllables and start with the letter F. Its NATO reporting name was Fargo. But going back a few years before the development of the NATO reporting name system, the Liberation Army Air Force, or the Air Force for the Communist Chinese Party at the time, and China had broken out into a bloody civil war. The Communists, known as the People's Republic of China, or PRC, were fighting the Democratic Party, or Republic of China, for control of mainland China. From October 1949 until February 1950, over 20 air raids were launched on mainland China and the PRC by the ROC Air Force flying B-25 Mitchells and B-24 Liberators escorted by P-38 Lightnings and P-51 Mustangs. Yes, we know Brian needs to do an episode on her. But besides the Mustang, you could check out an episode on all of these under Brian's episodes. These raids would hit power plants, transportation hubs, and ships. The worst of these raids happened on February 6, 1950, when 12 B-24s, 2 Mitchells, 2 P-51s, and a P-38 would drop over 67 bombs, each being a 500-pounder. Over 2,000 houses and buildings were destroyed, and over 1,400 civilians were killed. Soon after, the Soviet Air Force would get involved, sending over 100 of their own planes, including 38 of the new MiG-15s and 62 MiG-9s, of the over 600 that would be produced. They would be sent by rail to China, and then assembled by Soviet technicians and flown by Soviet pilots. From March to May of 1950, 4 air battles would occur, resulting in the loss of 6 ROC planes, leading soon after to the end of any major air engagement in the war. While the Soviets usually had their MiG-9s painted in the silver dart scheme that was common of the time, the Chinese landscapes would cause them to add more color by putting an olive green over a light gray, and would sometimes paint lines of camo over that. Over 900 Soviet ground crew and pilots were sent working also on other planes than the MiG-9 and 15, like the P-02 biplane. I love Brian's episode on that one, Yak-17 and Yak-11. By the war's end, over 372 of the 600 produced would participate in the Chinese Civil War. Now here's where things get a bit gray. The Korean War. U.S. records show a downed Chinese MiG-9 on November 18, 1963 by U.S. Air Force pilot Kenneth D. Chandler in a F-86 Alpha. But the Chinese do not confirm such a loss. By this time, the Chinese most likely had moved the MiG-9 to only the trainer role, as it had become obsolete with the additions of the F-86 and the MiG-15 to the battlefield. There are 2 known survivors. Red 1 is based at the Central Air Force Museum in Monaco, Moscow, Russia, while the other, White 30, is based at the Chinese Aviation Museum in Beijing, China. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I sure did, with all its wacky twists and turns. It may not have been the best aircraft in performance or capability to perform in general, but it was a great leap for Soviet aviation. Remember to never stop dreaming. This is Tanner signing off. Thank you.